So, the most fundamental element in photography is light. Light is what we need in order to get a good exposure, or in simpler terms, a well lit image. Obviously, if you're using a cell phone or set your camera to automatic, you can get a decent image. But if you're faced with a challenging lighting condition or a tricky moving subject, you find that shooting auto won't always get you what you need or intended. What will help you get those properly exposed shots in challenging situations is being familiar with the exposure triangle. So let's break it down. The triangle consists of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, the shutter speed is dictated by how fast the shutter opens and closes in front of the sensor. The quicker the shutter opens and closes, the less light you allow into the sensor. Conversely, the longer you leave the shutter open, the more you allow light in. When you see cars moving at a very fast speed without any blur whatsoever, or athletes suspended in air as if they're floating, the photographer was shooting at a very fast shutter speed. You'll find that as you slow the shutter down, objects can become a blur. In fact, the light trails that you see coming from cars in night photographs is a direct result of a slow shutter speed. With a slow shutter speed, you will get the best results using a tripod or resting the camera on a stationary surface, or else your body movements will introduce additional unwanted blur, which makes your whole picture look jumbled. As a rule of thumb, it's best to try to shoot no slower than 1/60th of a second handheld, and I personally like to say 1/100th of a second to be safe. Camera shake makes your subject look soft. So that's shutter speed, and it's pretty straightforward. With aperture, you control how much light hits the sensor through the opening and closing the iris within the lens. Just remember, shutter speed takes place in the camera, aperture takes place in the lens. When you adjust aperture, you're adjusting the focal plane. And the focal plane refers to the parts of the image that is in focus. Within the focal plane, you have an area that is the most in focus, and the surrounding areas will slowly fall out of focus. As you increase your aperture, you broaden the amount of area that is in focus. We refer to this as having a deep depth of field. For a deep depth of field, you'll be shooting at an aperture of f8 or f11 or greater. We stop down to a deep depth of field when we want to show the details of the environment. We show the details of the environment because it may be relevant to the subject or the focal point. When the environment isn't as important, we can open up the aperture to produce a shallow depth of field. The biggest characteristic of a shallow depth of field is the isolation of your subject. This means that your focal plane is greatly reduced. And so the reason we say open up aperture is because within the lens, the iris is physically widening or opening up, letting in more light. When we stop down, we close the iris, which lets in less light. You want to shoot at an aperture close to f1.2 or 2.8 if you want that shallow depth of field look. Lastly, let's take a look at ISO. The ISO deals with the sensitivity of the sensor. The most important thing to remember about ISO is the higher the ISO, the more noise or grain and less image quality. So obviously that means that the lower the ISO, the lower amount of noise, the better image quality, 100, 200. Consider low ISO, while 1600, 3200, 6400 and up, consider high ISO. Only time you should consider raising ISO is when it gets too dark, you can't open your lens any wider to shoot with, or slower your shutter speed. The good thing is, as technology advances, cameras have increased the usability of high ISOs, making it possible to get cleaner, better looking images. Back in the analog film days, you get noticeable grain at 400, but with Canon and Sony getting 12,000 ISO being the norm, it's only going to improve from there. And that's pretty much the exposure triangle. Go out and practice, and eventually you'll get the hang of it. Okay? See you in the next one.